This video is brought to you by Brilliant. Pick up a new skill or just learn more about things like science, math, engineering, computer science, and so much more thanks to Brilliant's accessible and interactive courses. Try everything Brilliant has to offer for free for 30 days and get 20% off an annual subscription by visiting brilliant.org/skillup. Click the link below to get started or stick around to the end of the video to learn more. I want to begin this review the same way I did my Final Fantasy XVI review, which is to say that reviews are opinions. This is my opinion and my opinion only. I expect that there will be a broad range of opinions on Dragon Age the Veilguard, and I encourage you to seek them out. I do not have a monopoly on truth. As I've said many times before, I'm just a nerd with a microphone and a YouTube account. My opinion is no more or less valuable than anybody else's. Okay? Alright, so Dragon Age the Veilguard is a colossal disappointment. I really can't put it any other way. I spent 50 hours playing this, and it was time I desperately wished that I could get back. I started having my doubts at around the 10-hour mark. I was thoroughly checked out at the 20-hour mark, and the remaining 30 hours were just excruciatingly painful as I was forced to suffer through the endless morass of banality that is Dragon Age the Veilguard. In many ways, Veilguard is a bigger disappointment than Anthem was. Like, if I was to hand LeBron a tennis racket, I'd expect to see some pretty shitty tennis. BioWare never had any business making a looter shooter, and so when Anthem flopped, its failure was easily explained, easily reconciled. But if I hand LeBron a basketball, I expect to see some fucking points on the board, and it's impossible to imagine a bigger home court advantage than this for BioWare. The Dragon Age franchise, one of their most beloved and most successful, no pressure from EA to cram in all sorts of live service bullshit like it was meant to have at one point, but they pivoted away from that years ago. There's no in-game cash shop here, there was obviously plenty of development time and budget, there was the freedom for BioWare to make a BioWare-ass BioWare game, without any compromises, and without any excuses. In no way, shape, or form did BioWare meet the moment and capitalize on the opportunity that was handed to them. Dragon Age the Veilguard apes the most superficial elements of a BioWare game, making no effort to modernize what is a now fairly dated formula, while delivering absolutely none of the writing, characterization, and imagination that made its previous games so great. The writing is frankly terminal. It lacks any nuance or wit or wisdom. It cannot communicate ideas except to say them aloud to the camera. It manufactures petty, unbelievable tension because it doesn't know how to create anything more real, and it's too scared to ever be truly confronting or dark for fear that it might make the audience uncomfortable. Every interaction between the companions feels like HR is in the room, and every interaction led by the main character, Rook, sounds like he's addressing an under-12 soccer team before a semi-final, or teaching toddlers how to properly share toys. The way you build relationships with your companions is so woefully outdated, drawn-out quest lines completely divorced from the main plot, starring disposable villains and recycling the same settings, enemies, and bosses you find elsewhere. The romance system feels equally antiquated, heavily reliant on the "we'll bang, okay" button, even when it doesn't make sense for that to be an option, with no supporting systems behind it to make your romance decisions feel believable or consequential. The world design is so weird. I have never encountered worlds quite like this. They feel more like Overwatch maps than actual explorable spaces, and they're littered with puzzles so mind-numbingly stupid that I wonder how little BioWare must think of our ability to solve puzzles. And the combat is like, man, shallow is too kind a word. The lack of enemy variety, the sponginess of those enemies, how limited your control over party members is, it all makes combat so utterly mindless and so breathtakingly repetitive. Let me put it this way, I spoke to two other reviewers who both ended up lowering the difficulty to the easiest setting, not because it was hard, but because it was just so drawn out and so boring. I've never done that before for any game that I've reviewed, but I did it at the 40-hour mark here, and I swear to God, I wish I did it 20 hours earlier. I know how brutal all of this sounds, and I want to be super clear that I desperately wanted it to be different. I really did. I am aware of the stakes surrounding this game and what it means for BioWare's future, and I was praying so hard that BioWare's next game would be a fucking banger, and that the future of the studio would be secure, and that we'd all be looking forward to a Mass Effect game, but I cannot say any of those things, because the honest truth is that barring a few exceedingly rare moments, there wasn't a single aspect of Dragon Age the Veilguard that I actually enjoyed, and there are very few games that I play that I can say that of.
You're hurt, Nev, but the rest of us need to do something.
Like most BioWare games, Dragon Age the Valguard begins here in character creation. It is flexible in the sense that it has plenty of options and sliders, but it's all limited by one central constraint, and that's the game's very stylized aesthetic. Characters do not look like real people. They look like Pixar or DreamWorks characters. You think I'm exaggerating? This is Prince Charming from Shrek. Are you going to tell me this man wouldn't slot right into the Valguard aesthetic? Man, you could drop him in right now as a companion character and no one would bat an eyelid. It's obviously a choice that BioWare made. You don't accidentally end up with characters that look like this. On one hand, I respect it because they really swung for something different here. Absolutely. On the other hand, I really dislike how these characters look. I just don't like it. And I think it's a massive downgrade versus what this series has previously offered. Like, this is the new Morrigan, for example. If you've never played Dragon Age before, then this might not mean anything to you, but if you have played it, then this rendition is gonna look pretty weird. There are other returning characters making cameos in this game, stuff BioWare has asked us not to spoil, so I can't show it to you, but putting the new models side by side with the old models, it's pretty crazy to see how much worse they look here in Valguard. Nothing compares though to what they did to the Qunari. Like, holy hell, I have no idea what they were thinking. This is how they used to look in the Inquisition, like truly badass and intimidating, and this is how they look in Valguard. I mean, how on earth could BioWare have landed on these designs and thought, yep, that's it, ship it? The Qunari redesign looks comically bad, and it's also kind of lazy because now instead of looking like a truly distinct race with a different facial structure, the Qunari now just look like humans with horns. It really sucks. These character designs are distracting and they weaken the game's ability to deliver emotional moments. I don't think your characters need to look realistic for you to have a strong connection to them. There are millions of games that disprove that point. But this uncanny valley thing, this half human, half cartoon thing, it catches on the eye the same way an off note catches on the ear. It's hard not to be distracted by just how odd everyone looks. And in the more tense, emotional scenes, I found that their fake plastic faces made it harder for me to buy into whatever emotional distress they were selling. This is further compounded by BioWare's approach to facial animations, which is extremely outdated in 2024, especially for a game where you spend so much time looking at characters' faces. Like, take this example when my character is angrily trying to convince the Grey Wardens to act.
We don't have time to play Who's the Greyest Warden. You need to shut up and listen. The threat is real. The gods are coming, and they're bringing the Blight with them.
Or this clip when Rook is dressing down the team after a setback.
Last I checked, there are 2 gods out there. They've got plans, and we're falling behind. And if it wasn't clear enough after Demeter's crossing, it's clear now. They'll rain disease and death across Thedas unless we stop them.
In both instances, you really can't see the emotion that the voice actor is delivering. Compare those to this outburst from Cassandra 9 years ago in Dragon Age Inquisition.
Then we looked for Hawk, but he was gone too. We thought it all connected, but no. It was just you. You kept him from us.
Now look, for my money, Cassandra's face here looks angry and expressive. I'm not only hearing her rage, but I am seeing it too. And Valguard never manages to make these two things line up. Setting aside the more contemporary comparisons you could make to stuff like Baldur's Gate 3 or Cyberpunk or Guardians of the Galaxy, BioWare was doing faces and facial animations better nearly a decade ago, and that sadly is commentary that could be extended to almost every aspect of Dragon Age the Valguard. The one exception to this, I think, is the visual design of environments, which are regularly stunning. I don't like how these spaces are laid out or what you do in them, but they do look really nice. There's a range of settings from cityscapes to forests to darkened swamps to old hollowed out Grey Warden fortresses, and they all look great in their own way. They each feel visually cohesive with unique architectural styles and color palettes that create a very strong sense of space and place. As I said, I never enjoyed being in these environments, but I did enjoy looking at them. I will also say that Valguard runs extraordinarily well on a high-end PC, which doesn't always happen all the time, by the way, right? I played this at 4K ultra settings, ray tracing enabled, and even without DLSS frame generation, I was still able to hit over 100 frames per second very easily. With lower settings, with lower resolutions, with ray tracing off, and with frame generation as an option, I think there's a huge amount of headroom for this game to run really well on lower end PCs, but I haven't personally tested that, and I also couldn't test console performance. I also do note that this game is on Steam day one instead of just being on the EA launcher, which is fantastic. It's also Steam Deck verified, which is great. Most impressive of all, it's DRM free, which is a boon for not only performance, but also for game preservation. I really applaud EA for making these moves, and hopefully it's something that they'll continue to do in their future releases. But bottom line, when it comes to visuals and performance, Dragon Age the Veilguard is yet another reminder of how much more important art direction is over technical wizardry. Yes, the environments look really nice and the game runs well, but the main deliverable of a BioWare experience is a compelling saga starring a cast of characters who feel believable. The weird, stylized, waxy way these characters look is off-putting, and when combined with how stiff and unresponsive their faces are, Veilguard has immediately hamstrung itself in its ability to deliver on the promise of a BioWare game. A promise that is then thoroughly broken when we start looking at the writing underpinning all of this.
I wield the power of the blight. People are dying right now. You need to listen.
Might cost me still life. And you did anything to tell me?
Bring that first one down!
Okay, so we're going to talk about the writing of this game now, and in so doing, I'm going to spoil some minor things. No major events or reveals, but some little stuff, so if you're sensitive to that, then you can skip ahead to the timestamp on screen. I'll give you a minute to do that now. Okay, here we go. Dragon Age games have, generally speaking, been pretty dark. I mean, the first game opens with a ritual where you drink demon blood to join a sacred order, and one of the other guys doesn't survive that ritual. He just kind of dies right there on the spot, and then another guy freaks out and he's like, no, please don't make me do that. And then Duncan, who's conducting the ritual, knows that there's no way to back out of this ceremony, so he murders that dude in cold blood before whispering in his ear,
I am sorry.
Now, if that moment is like an 8 out of 10 in terms of how dark you might expect your fantasy to be, Dragon Age the Veilguard never gets above like a 2 or a 3 out of 10. It was genuinely shocking to me to see just how safe and cheery and bright and G-rated this whole thing was. Like, genuinely shocked, because there are precisely 0 moments where something happens that made me go, oh shit, alright, now we're talking. I used the word banality in my intro, and one of the biggest reasons this game feels so banal is because when you eventually realize that nothing bad is ever going to happen, you stop hoping for something interesting or surprising to happen. You just surrender yourself to the endless stream of predictable, inoffensive fantasy tropes. In place of more serious, more dark events and characters is the embrace of a more playful, silly tone. It's about keeping it light, like Balara here talking about the fact that 2 elven gods are now out to destroy the world.
Oh, you know, just finding out that 3 of my gods are out there trying to end the world. Why wouldn't I be okay?
Emmerich is a necromancer, and I know that sounds a little scary, raising the dead and commanding them as your minions, but don't worry, BioWare is not going to let you get freaked out by all that scary death stuff. Emmerich happens to be a lovely old gentleman. He is dapper, he is proper, he delights in pleasantries, and he has a servant, a lovable skeleton named Manfred, who happily dotes on Emmerich and screeches with glee whenever he's mentioned. He's not the only companion with a pet though. Davram also has a baby griffin named Asan, and he can be a little rowdy sometimes, like here when Manfred and Asan are squabbling over something.
Okay, that's enough. Quiet now. Fine. Who wants a treat?
Now look, I know that you could go back to previous Dragon Age games and pull the same clips that show the same lighthearted silliness. Lighthearted fun and humor has always been a part of every great BioWare game. But what I'm trying to communicate here is that there's a lot more of these moments in Veilguard, but more importantly, there's a complete absence of anything dark to counterbalance them. As such, the overall tone of this game is silly and juvenile. Its unwillingness to confront darker themes also extends to a total unwillingness to create any meaningful conflict between companions. Conflict between companions is a really important part of these sorts of cinematic RPGs. It not only creates narrative tension, but also forces important gameplay decisions, like who do you side with in a real moment of truth situation, right? Dragon Age the Veilguard has none of that. 0. Companions never have prolonged, substantive disagreements about anything. They just get along. almost all the time. And when they do express some sort of disagreement about something, it is so lukewarm and then resolved so quickly that the whole thing feels entirely cosmetic. Like during a mission, Lucanus makes a mistake and Davram calls him out on it very briefly. And I was like, oh, okay, maybe this is the start of the first inter-team conflict. Nope. Like an hour later, the very next conversation that we all have together is this.
You two done fighting then? I can't have you at each other's throats.
Lucanus is still an assassin. Kills people for money.
And Davrin's still self-righteous. Judgmental, too. Typical Warden. No offense.
If we let that get in the way of stopping the gods...
We won't. We cannot.
They were never at each other's throats, by the way. They literally had one perfectly civil conversation where no one even raised their voice, and now they've, patched it up. However, BioWare clearly want to create some semblance of conflict between team members, so they instead focus on petty squabbles. Like here, Emmerich wants to bring too many books to a camping trip that Harding is planning, and Harding is upset about that. Just watch the clip.
Harding, does it really matter if Emmerich brings 8 books?
9, actually.
And Emmerich? So what if Harding is fine sleeping on dirt?
Not all the time.
This is the sort of conflict that Valgard is constantly generating between team members, just arguing about utter nonsense. And did you see how Rook needed to sort it out at the end? He talks to them like they're children. Like, here's another example of him sorting out a disagreement between Tash and Emmerich when they're arguing about the fact that Tash doesn't like necromancy.
You two could still learn things together you'd never find out alone. Emmerich, you clearly find talking about dragons boring.
What? How? Who doesn't like dragons?
Aren't you curious why Tash likes them as much as you like necromancy?
The question crossed my mind.
And maybe Emmerich could help demystify magic, Tash.
See what I mean? That is not how you speak to adults. That is how you speak to a toddler when you are teaching them to share their Optimus Prime toy with their little brother. It speaks to a broader problem, that being a lack of subtlety and wisdom in the writing. This game cannot surface any ideas without just saying them aloud, which leads to this endless stream of exposition-laden personal introspection monologues. Like when Harding tells us that she's a bit of a people pleaser.
She hates it.
No, I don't hate it. It's really nice. Temperature.
I won't be upset if you don't like coffee.
He really wouldn't.
I know, but sorry. It's just this thing I do sometimes.
Acting so people will like you?
It sounds terrible when you say it like that. I know I don't need to do it. I just do.
Or here, when Nev opens up about the fact that she really just wants to prove that she can be relied on.
You can't count on a lot here. When I started, I wasn't going to save Minrathous, never mind Thedas. But if I could take a job and follow through, well, maybe people could count on me.
These clips alone aren't enough to convince you of what I'm saying, but I promise you that every emotional exchange has this sort of stuff in it. Rather than letting these sorts of character traits or insecurities surface through action or through the intuition of others, these characters just blurt them out all the time. There's nothing to read into or imagine about these characters because they simply tell you everything about themselves with this point-blank dialogue. And the way this dialogue is delivered makes this all the more painful because BioWare can't surface any of it in the main questline. All of it happens in chats at the home base or during companion missions. And this is where we start crossing over into criticisms of the game's structure, but Dragon Age the Valgard feels extremely outdated because of its inability to unify its companion stories with the main story. This is sort of how old BioWare games were. You would pursue companion storylines that were quite separate from the main storyline, but we've come a long way since then, and multiple games, most notably Baldur's Gate 3, have shown us that you can walk and chew bubblegum at the same time. You can deepen your connection to your companions both in and out of the main questline. Companion questlines are more deeply interwoven into that main questline. It doesn't feel like you're making these hard switches from save the world mode to go and pick flowers with your buddy mode. There certainly is some of that in those other games, don't get me wrong, but the overall calibration and pacing of it feels more integrated and more seamless. Not so here in Valgard. When you're doing the main questline, there are precious few moments when you also happen to be progressing a companion storyline That all happens in companion quests, which are each their own totally disconnected storyline, starring their own generic villain of the day style antagonist. And these quests are all meted out to you at the same time, meaning that you complete a major milestone in the main quest line, and that immediately unlocks like 6 or 7 companion missions, and if you're going to stay on top of them, you're just doing them one after the other. The main storyline is completely on hold in that moment. This is at its worst at the end of the game, where there's a literal 10-hour stretch where all you are doing is companion quests, because it's your last chance to do them, and the game doesn't let you finish these storylines any earlier, so you're just doing them one after the other. And look, I know that's very common for these sorts of games, and if these storylines were good, I probably wouldn't mind all that much, but they are not good. They are boring, and they are badly written, and they see you exploring all of the same locations you've already been to, fighting enemies and bosses you've already fought dozens of times before. It's a major shortcoming of this game. There is absolutely zero variety in mission design. It's all either walking behind your companion while they talk, or killing enemies. There's no like necromancy mission that sees you commanding an army of skeletons, no stealth mission with Lucanus to sneakily assassinate a target. You don't ever officiate over a joining ceremony with Davram and have to choose whether or not to execute a recruit who tries to flee. It's just lighting candles while someone talks, or fighting, and 80% of the time it's just fighting. So all of this was a point about writing and how the structure of the game puts the main storyline on hold for huge stretches because the companion quest lines are not integrated into the main quest line, and that feels really outdated and results in some really poor pacing. And that's an example of the writing being hamstrung by the game's structure, but it also cuts a different way, which is that the structure often dictates the writing. There's multiple moments throughout the main campaign where the writing is saying aloud, "You are playing a BioWare game. Time to do some BioWare things." Like in this exchange when the team has just suffered a major setback and they're discussing why they weren't successful. Here's what they came up with.
I think we've all been distracted.
I've been preoccupied myself after discovering that hand of glory.
And I can't stop worrying about my new magic and what it means.
The Nodists are fallen? What it means for my people?
Until those problems are resolved, we will not be prepared to face the gods.
It's like, bro, they are literally just listing side quests at this point and being like, if we don't solve these problems, we're not going to be at our A game. Like, does that really need to be said aloud? But it's something that they say again later on in a separate meeting.
Our arguments are personal problems. It's as Emmerich says. They hold us back.
We won't stop the gods while other worries weigh us down.
I'm pleased my words provided clarity on how we all felt.
Like, come on, for real, what is this? We already know we are playing a BioWare game. We don't need to be told to do companion quests. Like, how did this make it into the script? I really wish I could tell you that the main plot delivered where all this companion stuff fails, but it absolutely does not. This game used to be called Dragon Age Dreadwolf, and it was called that because the antagonist was Solus, an elven god who you fought alongside during Dragon Age Inquisition. And what a brilliant idea for an antagonist, someone who you know intimately if you'd played the previous game. Solus as a character is also fantastic. He is deep and complex and nuanced, and as a villain, he is a rich well from which a writer could draw. Now, Solus is an antagonist in this game, absolutely, but he plays a distant second fiddle to 2 other antagonists, a pair of totally generic, one-dimensional, unknowable, and uninteresting elven gods. They are just straight up mustache-twirling evil. There is nothing to them at all, and the main storyline is just about like chasing leads to find them and, you know, stopping them from crafting some MacGuffin, honestly. Now, Solus still does have a part in this game, which I won't spoil, and interactions with him are a high point, but he plays a far less central role than he could have played, and it's such a wasted opportunity to see him sidelined in favor of 2 villains who could not be less interesting or more generic. Tonally, Dragon Age: The Valguard is silly and childish. It lacks any real tension, dialogue feels inauthentic, more complex themes and character motivations are clumsily surfaced, the stories it wishes to tell are undermined by the game's outdated structure, and the overt references to the game's structure in the writing sound ridiculous. The main storyline is a huge disappointment owing to a lack of interesting missions and worthwhile antagonists. It's just a top to bottom disappointment. BioWare games live and die by their writing, and Dragon Age: The Valguard absolutely dies by it, and we have not yet even covered how little actual choice this game affords you, and that is equally disappointing.
Careful of him. I want to talk to him.
You and me, Rook. We chase trouble.
I'm here because you didn't listen.
Whatever's out there, we'll face it together, I promise.
together.
The promise of a BioWare game has always been a story that you can tangibly shape. BioWare has had mixed levels of success with this goal over the years, but it's remained a guiding star for them, and for all the games in this genre that sought to copy the template that BioWare initially laid down with this cinematic-style, narrative-led RPG. Dragon Age: The Veilguard marks a low point in BioWare's pursuit of this goal, so much so that I really wonder if this is what they were intending all along, or if maybe like they had other ambitions, but they ran out of time and they just couldn't make them happen. I just refuse to believe that what we got here in Veilguard could have been BioWare's actual intention from the start. Fundamentally, the promise of choice exists at both the macro and micro level. In the past, BioWare games have not only let you select your hairstyle, but also, through dialogue options, shape your personality. Are you a nice guy, a jester, an asshole, or does your mood change depending on who you're speaking to? Do you make cold, calculated calls that prioritize the mission, or are you more empathetic, putting the needs of your team first? How people and the world at large react to those decisions shapes your journey. Maybe a member of the team really hates your guts and has no time for your bullshit. Maybe another loves you so much that they swoon when you so much as glance their way. Maybe a certain faction declares you a blood enemy for making a decision that disadvantages them, while another will have your back no matter what because you were there for them when it counted. Almost everything that I've described here is either absent in Veilguard, or it's so surface level that the decisions feel entirely cosmetic. The biggest gap for me personally is the inability to truly shape a Rook, a main character, that reflects who I want to be. I always choose the bad guy personality type in BioWare games because, generally speaking, renegades have more fun.
Say goodnight, Manuel.
The darkness is coming. The end is near. You can't...
There is no bad guy option here in Veilguard. There's only nice guy, there's nice guy who's a little bit more jokey, and nice guy who's like ever so slightly more stern. That's literally it. Those are your only three options. Sometimes there's an additional option that's meant to be like the angry option, but what the game does, and this drove me fucking nuts, is it takes the edge off the dialogue option you've selected to make it something more friendly. Like this clip when some asshole bureaucrat barges into the conversation making demands, and I want to say, who is this fool? Because that would be an antagonistic thing to say that might result in some conflict. Instead, here's what Rook actually ends up saying.
Who is this?
This is Governor Evenchi. They have concerns.
Or this example, when I'm trying to get the head of the Grey Wardens to listen to me, and I just reach my wit's end.
Are you kidding me?
I assure you, I am deadly serious.
That is not what I wanted to say. I wanted to call him an idiot, but I can't do that because Rook is incapable of saying anything that might offend or upset anyone. And this is very much the case with his team too. With the exception of one pivotal decision point, Rook cannot upset his team members in any meaningful way. In so many BioWare games and games like it, you could say some mean shit that would really piss off your companions, but here all you can do is offer support. Sometimes in a friendly way, other times in a slightly more stern way, but never can you say anything that might actually upset them. But that's not to say that you can't say things that your teammates won't mildly disapprove of, and you will on occasion see like Nev disapproves pop up on the left, but there's no way to do that so severely or so often that you would start to develop a negative relationship with your companion. There is a really interesting companion system kind of working away in the back end called Hardened, where a companion apparently disapproves of you so much that their offensive damage abilities are made stronger, but they won't cast any supporting abilities, and your relationship progress with them is also slowed. I could only achieve this state with one companion, Nev, after making that pivotal decision I mentioned earlier. Outside of that, I almost always chose the gruffest dialogue option available to me, and I was never able to trigger this hardened state with any other companion. Oh, and by the way, I never felt the impact of Nev's new damage potential during combat, and I had absolutely no trouble romancing Nev even after she was hardened, so I think the system isn't quite as impactful as it promises to be. The same way that the game is unwilling to confront any darker themes, the same way the game is unwilling to create any genuine conflict between party members, it's also unwilling to create genuine tension between you and your party members. So remember how in most BioWare games you could talk yourself out of trouble if you said the right things, made the right threats, if you put the work in to ingratiate yourself to a faction, if you have the right party member by your side at a crucial moment. We used to have stats for charisma and speechcraft that would make it easier whether we're trying to persuade or intimidate or deceive. Veilguard has none of those things. You cannot talk your way in or out of any situation. There are no stat checks that will test your powers of persuasion or whatever. Every outcome is ultimately determined by force because there is no scope for you to determine it by any other means. This was really typified in this mission, which seemed like it was going to be a real standout. This is towards the back end of the game, and we have to infiltrate a meeting of cultists, and we're supposed to be undercover. To this point, there had never ever been any mission like this. As I said earlier, every mission is just following someone, going to a place, killing enemies, and so the promise of like a stealthy undercover mission was really exciting because I was desperate for just something else. So how does this actually play out? Well, firstly, we're undercover, but we leave our faces uncovered while we walk around this encampment, and we're basically the only people not wearing a hood, and we've been fighting this faction for the last 30 hours, so you'd expect they know our faces by now, but anyway, eventually we come to a dude and he's blocking the way, and I expect this might be a moment where I have to smooth talk him, and if I say the wrong thing, maybe the jig is up and it's time to fight, but nope, here's what actually happens.
Stop. Who are you? I don't recognize any of you.
You don't recognize me?
I don't... Magister... Lady,
Appalling. They'll hire anyone these days.
So the best my dude can conjure in that moment is, and then Nev takes over and does all the talking for us. No chance for me to have any input into how this goes down, and when it ends, we stand right there, in the middle of these goons, talking openly about how we plan to murder the gods they worship.
It's Elganon, not Gillenane like we expected.
Shame. We have unfinished business with her.
Next time I see her, she's dead.
The game opens with a sequence where you have a choice. Either you can talk your way through a situation or just resort to violence. Having played through this game, I can tell you right now that that moment is very deceptive because it suggests that this is a game where moments like this are a regular occurrence, and they absolutely are not. I'm not exaggerating when I say that outside of the companion missions, where you can decide how those stories end, and outside of the game's 2-hour finale, where you do make some serious impactful decisions, there were a total of 2 moments in this entire game where I felt like I was making a consequential decision that would actually affect the flow of events. 2. Now, I'm not sure if there were additional consequential decisions buried in some side content or something I didn't do, but I played this game for 50 hours, and for me, it was 2. And I know that sounds hyperbolic. You're thinking, that cannot possibly be right, but I promise you, there are 2 moments in this game where you make a meaty decision, and the rest of it just feels like choosing between different colored M&Ms. I can't be more specific without spoiling things, but if you play this game, you'll see what I mean. Another load-bearing, choice-based system in any BioWare game is romance, and this has its own set of issues. Top line, it's just a super old, super outdated approach to player romance. It really is just selecting the heart button whenever it appears, even when it doesn't feel right for that moment, and rarely does it feel right for that moment, by the way. You just keep hitting that button repeatedly until you nearly kiss, and then something interrupts that moment, and then you come back later, and you need to either commit to that person or permanently close off any possibility of a romantic entanglement. So for me, I was flirting with everyone, and I was making progress with everyone. I had every member of my squad ready to jump me, but at one point I thought, okay, let's give Harding a try. Commit to that, see what happens. So here's what happens. We have a scene where we kiss, there's no sex scene. We can continue whispering sweet nothings into each other's ears during dialogue exchanges or whatever, but at that point, romance dialogue options no longer appear for any other character at all. There's no option to end my relationship with Harding and switch over to someone else. Most interestingly, none of the other companions, all of whom were very hot and heavy for me, none of them mention the fact that I have spurned their affections and gone with someone else. It's like all that flirting before never happened, and there's no disappointment and resentment about the fact that it led nowhere. It's consistent with what I spoke about earlier. There cannot be any actual conflict within the team, and a broken heart might make for some conflict. So instead, it's just ignored, and it really makes the entire romance system seem as cheap and as flimsy as every other decision you make in Veilguard, masquerading as something real and meaningful when it just isn't. The absence of genuine choice at both the macro and micro level makes Dragon Age of Veilguard feel entirely on rails. The illusion of choice that is dangled in front of you is deeply frustrating because it teases a game that just isn't there, but it was there years ago in so many of the BioWare games we loved. The contrast between the past and present of BioWare's game design couldn't be more stark or more disappointing. this is already a pretty long review, but I do want to touch on Valguard's more playable elements, namely level design, open world activities, and of course combat. The level design in Dragon Age of Valguard is very odd. It's essentially a collection of very narrow, labyrinthine corridors. It doesn't matter if it's a forest or a city or a necropolis or whatever, it all feels the same. The game does not have any truly open spaces that you can explore or where you can make unique, surprising discoveries. This feels very counterintuitive in spaces that would naturally lend themselves to more open space, like, you know, one set near a beach or what's left of a battlefield. But funnily enough, it's actually kind of weirder in the cityscape areas. These cities feel more like Overwatch maps in the way they twist and turn and how they're connected by zip lines, and the only way to get from point A to point B is to clamber over garden lattice, and it just feels really fake. Like, these are not real places, they're just video game levels. In terms of what you do in these spaces, most of it is just combat. We'll talk about that in a second. There's also side quests. I did a handful of these, but honestly, they were just very generic MMO-style side quests that involved going to a place to either kill or collect stuff, because again, this game has no other mission variety other than that. Maybe some of the side quests that I didn't do are good. I wouldn't know. The ones that I did weren't, and so I didn't do any more of them after about the 20-hour mark. The other thing that you do in these environments is you open them up by completing puzzles. When you step into these levels, they're at first sectioned off, and you can expand them by unlocking a door or building a bridge, etc. So these puzzles, let me show you one puzzle you need to build a bridge. Now I know you think I'm cherry picking the worst possible example, so here's another one. Okay, so maybe the energy cube thing is a little too heavy-handed an example. Surely there are more intricate and demanding puzzles than that. Here's one puzzle where I have to twist some statues to open a door. Just, here we go.
Those two statues are the spare key. Line up the symbols.
What did you mean by it's back?
Something stalking Grey Wardens. We call it the Gloom Howler. I'm hunting it.
I have like half a dozen other clips that are like this that are just the most mind-numbingly stupid puzzles you've ever seen in your life. It was like insulting to have to complete them. I genuinely do not understand how these made it into the game in this way. It's like BioWare thought that they needed to have some environmental puzzles, but didn't have enough time to make them good, or to make them any more challenging than like that bucket with the lid where you push the shapes through it. It's not just these puzzles that are half-assed, by the way, it's also open-world activities. So in addition to side quests, there are also these statues that you find which ask you to complete a quick challenge to earn some permanent, bonus health. That's fine. Here's what doing one of those statues looks like. That's it! That's the puzzle! And they're all like this. This isn't some tutorial version of it. They are all this obvious and this easy. Again, why are these in the game? If I was to guess, I would say they're intended to serve as a pacing mechanism to break up the otherwise relentless focus on combat. And that's an admirable goal, because Lord knows, like, the less combat we have to do in Dragon Age of Valguard, the better. Combat's problems are as multi-layered as every other problem in this game, but the core of it is that just as there is no meaningful choice or variation in the RPG side of Valguard, there's also no choice or variation in the combat model. You will choose a class, in my case the warrior, and you'll have 3 abilities you can have on your hotbar at any time. There are plenty more abilities to unlock in the skill tree, but pretty quickly you realize that it doesn't really matter what those other abilities have to offer, because the lack of enemy variety and how easily those enemies are dodged, parried, or stun-locked, you really don't need to adapt your approach to anything. I can't overstate how limited the enemy design is in Valguard. You may see enemies that look different from one another, but functionally they are almost identical, with highly telegraphed attacks that are easily neutralized and extremely limited movesets that cannot pressure you in any way, shape, or form. No enemy in this game possesses a unique threat distinct from another enemy. You approach and dispatch every single one of them in the exact same way over and over and over again. You can switch weapons whilst playing, and that might have been an opportunity for BioWare to let you bind new abilities to that weapon type, opening up what might ostensibly look like a new combat style that you could switch between on the fly. But they didn't do this. When you switch your weapon, your abilities remain the same, so combat still feels the same whether I'm swinging an axe or using a sword and board. Now, to be clear, the only character you can control on the battlefield is Rook, but you can issue orders to your party members. This in itself is a massive missed opportunity because it would have been really cool to be able to play as a different combat style. But again, BioWare did not let us do that. Your party members each have 3 abilities that they combine to their hotbars, and at first I was like, okay, that means I'll need to be carefully choosing which ability to use at which moment, and etc, etc. But no, using one ability puts all abilities on cooldown. So instead of party members feeling like actual party members, they're essentially just another cooldown on your hotbar, one that you can hit every like 15 to 30 seconds. What makes this worse is that the game uses a primer and detonator system, where I want to use one ability on one companion because it primes a target, and I then want to use another ability on another companion because it detonates that prime target. And these detonations deal not only big damage, but also AoE damage, and so much of it that you never want to use any other ability in your arsenal. You just use the same spell combination over and over and over again, because frankly, you're playing the game wrong if you don't. So imagine you constantly spamming the same 3 abilities on your hotbar against the same repetitive enemy types while constantly using the exact same primer and detonator combo on your companions, and imagine doing that for 50 hours. There's a million other things I could say about this combat, like the frustratingly gated skill tree, which forces you to spend points on bullshit since you can only get a good upgrade every 10 levels, or the really basic upgrade and enchantment system which adds so little value that it may as well not be in the game. But I'll just finish by saying this. This is a world boss that I encountered early in the game. I was level 10, this thing was level 25. I would not be level 25 for another 15 hours. So that's how challenging this encounter was meant to be. Despite this, I did this encounter without dying and without a healer in my party. I just grinded him down because his moveset was so basic, so limited, and so easy to counter that all it took was time. And that's all the combat ever takes, because enemies are so spongy. And like I said, I've never done this before, but at the 40-hour mark, I took the advice of a friend who lowered the difficulty to the lowest setting just because they were so over it, and I cannot tell you how much better this experience was when I did that. Combat did not become better, it just meant that I no longer had to suffer through it, as enemies would die in just a few quick hits instead of soaking up dozens of them. My strong advice to you is that if you do plan to play this game, play it on normal difficulty for like the first 10 or so hours. By that point, you've honestly seen everything the Combat Sandbox has to offer, every ability, every enemy type, every boss type. So just lower the difficulty at that point and focus on the story, because yeah, I really wish I had taken that advice far, far earlier.
Everyone suit up. All hands for this one.
So I want to be clear that the finale of this game is actually fantastic. It's a 2-hour gauntlet, and while the combat side of it remains the same, there are multiple impactful decisions to be made, there are multiple meaningful revelations, there are multiple thrilling set pieces full of action and emotion. Playing that final 2 hours, you cannot but think to yourself, imagine if the entire game was like this. But the reality is that the rest of the game is not remotely like that. The rest of the game is meandering and dull and childish, and all of its systems are so surface level. And that is my biggest criticism of Dragon Age The Veilguard. It is just so surface level. It has companions, but neither them nor their stories are any deeper than a puddle. It has a romance system, so it ticks that box, but it feels so awkward and cheap. It regularly offers you the choice to choose between this thing or that thing, but those decisions don't really mean anything. It has puzzles and side activities that feel almost placeholder, and it has this very flashy looking combat system that presents really well in a preview slice, but when you have to spend any more than a few hours with it, you see just how hollow and repetitive it is. I really struggled a great deal with how to write this review, and that's not like performative hand-wringing when I say that, by the way. As I've matured in this job, I've become far more aware of how I talk about games, striving to do so in a way that is both critical and constructive. And so as I look back over this script, I really wish I had more constructive things to say. But the truth is, I don't, and I'm no good to anyone if I'm not totally honest about how I feel about a video game. I would again stress though that this is just my opinion, and I know there are people out there who do enjoy this video game, so my only ask is that in addition to watching this review, please go and seek out the more positive ones as well. Find people with whom this game resonated, because this game might resonate with you too. And as I've said many times before, I would hate for my take to deprive you of an experience that you might love. For me though, Dragon Age The Veilguard was so disappointing that I cannot muster any enthusiasm or excitement for the Mass Effect project that BioWare are currently working on. I hope they get the chance to make that game, and I hope it succeeds where Veilguard failed. But if either of those things are to happen, it's going to be against all odds, because I think Veilguard will mark a permanent shift in the way we talk about BioWare, and it's a shift that makes me really sad. Let me ask you this. Are you doing a little something every day to expand your horizons, learn something new, gain a new skill? Now I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, dude, it's enough for me just to get out of bed and get to work every day. How am I going to find time for all that? Well, that's kind of where this video's sponsor, Brilliant, comes in. Brilliant is a learning platform that gamifies learning. They have dozens of courses on topics like science, mathematics, computer science, and so much more. And each of the courses are broken up into little bite-sized chunks that you can knock over in just a few minutes. Brilliant will regularly test your learning to make sure you've got it, and then it'll award you experience points and achievements for making progress, encouraging you to continue with your learning journey. And it's super convenient too, since Brilliant does have a fully featured mobile app, which is how I use it. So yeah, I'll boot up a mobile game or doom scroll social feeds, but I'll also spend a little bit of time each day on Brilliant. And you know what? It's one of the few things I do on my phone each day that's actually a good use of my time. Plus, it helps you learn actual practical skills too. Like if you're considering a career in programming, or even if you're already working in that field, then Brilliant is full of things that will either teach you something new or help deepen your expertise. Like you can learn the basics of Python through Brilliant, and their creative coding courses help you get in a coding mindset, ready to tackle more advanced challenges. Best of all, you can try it free for 30 days, absolutely no cost. But if you do want to get an annual subscription, you get a 20% discount on it when you visit brilliant.org/skillup. Start learning for free for 30 days and get 20% off an annual subscription over at brilliant.org/skillup. Thanks Brilliant for sponsoring the video, and thank you for watching it.